for your patience. I see we now have Brian join the call. So Brian, could I ask you to start your presentation, please?
Yes, Tony, and hello, everybody. This presentation is about the growing liquidity crisis in the air transport industry. If we look at the spread of the COVID virus, it's now, as of the 15th, covering markets which represent 94% of global passenger revenues. So, this is now impacting, the entirety of air transport. And it's not, of course, just the impact of the virus, it's also the, perhaps more importantly, the impact of border closures and travel restrictions. So, in many cases, demand for
Two participants are now joining.
Demand for the business of many airlines has fallen to zero. Just a week and a half ago, we released two scenarios on how we saw the COVID virus impacting airline revenues. And the worst case scenario, which we presented here, where we expected the industry to take a hit of about $113 billion just on passenger revenues, representing 19 or 20% of the global. We're already there.
Unknown participant is now joining.
We're not revising these estimates today, although they're clearly worse than this, particularly in Europe and particularly in the Americas. Our focus today is on liquidity and the growing crisis. Because even before the COVID-19 crisis, if you look below what seem to be good industry total performance figures for finances, the numbers show that those improvements over the past decade since 2008 have really been driven by a small number of airlines. It's actually only been about 30 airlines globally that have driven the improvement. There's a long tail of airlines that haven't really seen any improvement in the last decade and are pretty close to balance or net loss. So the industry
participant is now joining.
Is still rather fragile. And at times like this, crisis times like this, it's actually balance sheets that are the critical thing for survival. The top 30 airlines over this period have managed to reduce their debt to earnings or EBITDA ratio.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
They're more or less investment grade, but the rest of the industry, the vast majority of airlines, still have high levels of debt. And that means there are fixed obligations to pay, even in the absence of any revenues. And that's the critical thing driving the crisis for liquidity. If we look at the situation at the start of the year in terms of airlines' balance sheets, in terms of the cash and near cash equivalents that they can draw on quite easily to pay bills, this shows the ratio of that cash, those cash balances, to really non-avoidable costs, the fixed costs that airlines would have to pay even if they're not operating. And as you can see, more or less 75% of the airlines that we looked at have had less than 3 months of cash and equivalents to cover those costs. Obviously, there are a number of airlines that have much. Yes.
Right. Can I interrupt you for just 1 minute? Your presentation does not seem to be showing.
Okay, let me just... Right. Now, is that visible now?
Yes.
Right. Okay, let me very quickly go back to this slide here, just to repeat what I said. If you look at this slide here, I think it's clear that even before COVID, the industry was in a fairly fragile position. Only 30 airlines drove the improvement in profitability that we saw in the last 10 years. There was a long tail of airlines with much more fragile finances. And that's particularly true if we look at the balance sheet position. The top 30 airlines over that period have reduced the debt relative to EBITDA or earnings pretty much to investment grade. They are still quite resilient.
Is now joining.
The majority of the industry has got high levels of debt, and that means fixed obligations. That means that airlines have to pay and service that debt even in the absence of revenues, and that's driving the liquidity crisis that we have today. If we look here at the amount of cash airlines had at the beginning of the year, and this is cash and near cash instruments that can be used to pay bills.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
If we look at the non-avoidable costs or the fixed costs airlines face, 75% of the airlines we looked at had actually less than 3 months of cash to pay those fixed costs. Now, obviously, there are a number of airlines that are in a much stronger position to weather this lack of revenues, but the majority are in a very fragile place. As well as those fixed expenses, there are also short-term liabilities that have to be serviced, interest paid, and this shows the ratio of the cash to those liabilities with less than 1 year maturity. So a number of those will have to be repaid and refinanced. And as you can see, cash is in most cases less than those current liabilities. And so it's a combination of the fixed costs and also the short-term liabilities that are driving this liquidity crisis. And I'd like to finish on this chart here, which shows the amount of cash and equivalents airlines had at the beginning of the year by region as a ratio of revenues. It basically shows you how many months worth of cash airlines have. And again, this was the state at the beginning of the year. And the yellow markers in the middle of those ranges shows the median or the typical airline. So on average, airlines have more or less had about 2 months worth of cash at the start of the year. And that's
is now
pretty much running out for many airlines today.
Is now exiting.
Thank you very much, Brian. Can I now ask Alexandre to deliver his comments on that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Tony. If you hear me, now the connection is working.
Yep, can hear you.
Yeah, okay, good. So good afternoon, everyone from Geneva. First of all, I'd like to tell you that of course, the global air transport industry is responsibly responding to this pandemic. We are not public health experts, but we do everything to comply and with the guidelines, regulations, recommendations coming from experts, particularly the WHO, and of course, they're adapting our operations to the challenges of this virus. Let me start with cargo. We haven't talked a lot about cargo. Usually the restrictions that government have introduced have restricted passenger travel, but by doing so, they have a significant impact on our cargo operations because they shrink the size of passenger operation by removing significant cargo capacity from the system. No passenger aircraft, less bellies, less cargo traffic. And so less availability even for the critical medical equipment, medical staff, or any technical equipment or people that could be required to fight the virus. So we have called government to do whatever they can to ensure efficient cargo operation. So that include exempting crew
Unknown participant is now exiting.
who do not interact with the public from quarantine, granting temporary traffic rights where needed, and keep cargo excluded from travel restrictions. So that's for the air cargo. I wanted to point that out because it's an important point in our operations and in the fight against the virus. Second point, the relief measures we are working on. After what Brian Pearce, our chief economist, has told you, we are obviously in an extraordinary time, terrible crisis, one of the most severe we have ever had. And so we have asked government to take extraordinary measures. It started with slots. We have asked for a waiver on slots, particularly the 80-20 use it or lose it rule. Many governments have responded positively. The EU has granted this waiver until June. We are asking to include all the summer season. Normally, we review
Is now joining.
And so we should have a positive decision, not only in the EU, but in main part of the world to waive this slot rule. Secondly, in terms of regulation, we are also asking to soften some of the passenger right regulations, particularly the EU 261, because we have to cancel flights. We are canceling hundreds.
Unknown participant is now joining.
Every day. Under this regulations, we are requested, first of all, not to cancel before certain delay or to ensure significant compensation packages. We think that these rules are too tough in these extraordinary times, and that we ask government to understand that it's totally beyond the financial capacity of airlines to comply with these rules. Second type of measures that we're asking, the big financial measures. We have started by requesting government to reduce charges, so airport charges, overflight fees, taxations that are on passenger or on security, whatever could relieve airline cost or the airline P&L. But it's not enough, and it's not at the size of this crisis. So we have asked government to think, to design, and to implement much broader financial support package that could go to a direct financial support to carriers to compensate for reduced revenues. So it can also include loans guarantees, or support for the corporate bond market by the government or by the central banks, either directly to the airline or to commercial
banks. Is
banks,
now joining.
To ensure that they are able to finance the liquidity of the treasury or the cash shortage that our members or the airlines are facing. We are also asking for tax relief or rebates or suspension of all employer-imposed payroll taxes, reduction in income taxes, extension of payment terms, everything on which
is now exiting.
May have a significant action to reduce our cost and our cash expenses on the short run. So as there is no one-size-fits-all solution, we are writing to governments to ask for these measures, to propose a set of measures that would be applicable. The two key points are the following. First one is timing. We are as you have seen with Brian, we are in a very, very tough liquidity crisis. So we ask the government to act urgently. That is of the essence again. Secondly, we think that the fact that government focus on airline is not only a selfish view of the situation. We fully understand that many other economic sectors are heavily touched, but we think that connectivity is crucial to maintain economic activity, and connectivity is also crucial to ensure that the recovery will be fast and significant enough. So if we want to maintain a strong airline sector able to cope with this difficult crisis, but able also to provide the resources to ensure that the recovery will happen in due time, but with the appropriate speed and strength, we need government to act strongly and quickly. So that's what I wanted to say as preliminary remarks, and we are expecting your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandre. We do have quite a number of people on this call. So as I mentioned earlier, we will take your questions via the chat function. So if anyone has a question, please type it into the chat function, and we will get through as many of those as we can in the remaining time. Who has the first question?
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Okay, Alexandre, the first question is the CAPA report yesterday said that many airlines will go bankrupt by the end of May. What do you make of this assessment? I suppose that's for Brian or for Alexandre.
It is when you read Brian's slides, it's compatible, or it's the logical conclusion you might draw from the liquidity shortage we are facing. But Brian is, of course, more expert to comment on that.
Yes, let me add to Alexandre's remarks. That is clearly a risk because airlines are running out of cash. They won't be able to sustain operations. Obviously, there are a number of airlines that do have credit lines and access to cash who will be able to
Unknown participant is now joining.
But there's a large number in a much weaker position. And I think, the difficulty is many of those airlines were very profitable before this crisis. So this is not necessarily a solvency crisis. It's a shortage of cash, which is why Alexandre was calling for governments to support the industry by various mechanisms to provide that cash for a temporary period.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Next question is, do you think governments are listening to our requests?
We are pretty satisfied at this stage. It's an early stage by the reactions and the attitude of governments. They are really in a listening mode. They are understanding that this industry is in a very, very bad situation. And we have had from several governments significant opening. We'd like to quote the Singapore, South Korea, even China. In Europe, we understand that the EU is preparing a support package for the whole economy, but that would be applicable and usable by the airlines sectors. We have seen various public statements coming from many governments.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
In the UK. So we are pushing hard, but governments are listening.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question asking about the $113 billion estimate on revenue lost. Is that too low?
Yes, undoubtedly it's too low. the virtual closure of the North Atlantic market, which is a $20 billion a year passenger revenue market, immediately changed that. And the assumptions we made were that airlines would face a sort of Chinese-style fall in demand of the same scale, but not the closure of borders and the fall to zero in many markets. We can't say exactly at this stage how much. That's an underestimate, but the situation is worse than we thought it would be.
Okay. This question is asking if there's any regional divergence in the way we see the industry crisis playing out.
Let me comment initially. Yes, there is. And in China, where the authorities seem to have got the COVID-19 more or less under control, apart from some imported cases, we're actually seeing a return to work and a return to air travel. On the domestic market, I think that load factors are back to 60%, and schedules are rising. So we are seeing a recovery phase in China, but certainly that's not the case in Europe and North America, and the spread into the Americas and the Middle East and Africa, where the situation is deteriorating very rapidly.
Okay. I have a question saying we've been primarily talking about international aviation, but do you see domestic markets being hit by this crisis as well? Alexandre, you're muted.
Sorry. So I said, of course, domestic markets are also heavily impacted because governments have implemented, confinement measures and restriction on internal travels. So it's even the case in some areas in the US in which some administration have asked their personnel not to travel domestically. So yes, of course, domestic markets are also heavily impacted, but not at the same level up to now as the international market.
Okay. We have a question asking about job losses with respect to the Asia Pacific, but I suppose globally. Brian, do you have any insight on that?
Well, that's very severe. So the airlines are doing whatever they can to survive, and so they're taking costs out of the business, which has meant significant job loss. But I think that I'd also stress the wider impact, because air transport plays a critical role in supporting jobs across the economy through the trade and the investment and the tourism that it carries. And so we're seeing jobs being lost across the economies because of these air transport restrictions. So we've got no numbers at the moment, but clearly it's going to be a major impact.
Okay. We have a question about passenger numbers as well. We predicted some 4.7 billion passengers would travel this year. Have we revised that downwards? Well,
that was a roughly 4% increase in passenger numbers. In the worst case scenario that we presented earlier, a week and a half ago, we were expecting to see something like a 16% contraction in passenger numbers. Given what we've seen recently, it's going to be significantly further from that. We plan to release some new numbers on that perhaps in a week's time.
Okay. The U.S. industry has asked for $50 billion from the U.S. government. How much do we think we will need in terms of the overall industry?
If we extrapolate from these figures, if we see what we need in terms of cash or restructuring, and without without adding some measures like chômage technique or chômage partiel that are implemented mainly in Europe and in some other countries, it would be something around 50 billion. 50.
Just for clarification, in addition to what the U.S. industry has requested?
No, as a whole, including the 15 the U.S. industry has requested.
Okay. Next, a question from Tom Ballantyne on the price of oil, noting that it has dropped dramatically. How much impact is that having on airline costs?
Well, that helps a lot. We've seen something like a $20 a barrel fall in the price of oil and jet fuel since the start of the crisis. Down to the range of $30 a barrel or so. In a full year, that would save the industry something like $28 or $30 billion from its fuel bill. But obviously, the revenue losses are way in excess of that. And for airlines, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere with high hedging ratios, they aren't in a position to benefit from that fall in the spot price of fuel. Some airlines are, but this is exacerbating the liquidity crisis in Europe.
Okay. A question about how the industry will emerge from this crisis. Do we see this as being having structural changes to the industry?
But it will probably, if this crisis continues at that intensity, it is clear that we will see a restructuring of this industry and probably a consolidation. With unfortunately some airlines disappearing, and the others trying to consolidate around them or around new groups, the bits and pieces of the airline that will have fallen in that crisis.
Okay. We have another question asking about a comparison to the financial crisis of 2008 when banks were bailed out. And the question is basically, why should airlines be supported?
That's a very good question. First of all, we are not claiming to be the only sector to be supported, and we understand that other sectors are also in very big trouble. But the reason why we ask government to focus on airlines is because connectivity is absolutely crucial, essential to first the economic development generally, but also to the potential and the incoming economic recovery. If we want this crisis to be finished, to come to an end fast and quickly, from an economic standpoint, the need for a strong airline sector to provide the resources to transport, the business people, to transport goods, to transport tourists and travelers is absolutely critical for the intensity and the speed of the economic recovery. In addition, as I mentioned in my preliminary remarks, we are also very important to ensure that the fight against the virus is effective, because we transport a lot of medical specialists and medical equipments.
Okay. One further question on that, and reflecting back on the earlier question we had, noting that the U.S. industry has asked for $50 billion in bailout. what are we looking at in terms of scale globally?
If it's a bailout, but the question before, as I understood, was the direct flux of money going to the airline. If it's a bailout or general guarantee that governments could give to the industry, the figures are much higher. I think we should envisage something like 150 to 100 billion.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Alexandre. Yep. Next question is, in terms of a recovery, we've previously talked about a V-shaped recovery, but how do we see the most optimistic or pessimistic timelines for the industry once we get this under control?
Shall I tackle that first, Alexandre? Yes, all past pandemics have seen air travel and also cargo follow a V-shaped recovery. So, 6 months, 9 months past the outbreak, we have seen demand to travel return to where it was before the crisis. In principle, I think there's no reason to doubt that will happen again. I think the challenge for the airline industry is that what's different this time is that this has spread globally, and as it spreads, we're getting different profiles. It's going to take while China is maybe moving to recovery phase, the rest of the world is not. So that will extend the period for recovery out, over a considerable period. And I think the challenge we face today is, can airlines last that long before they run out of cash without any support?
Okay. Great. Thank you, Brian. Did you want to add anything to that, Alexandre?
No, for me, it's absolutely the same answer. Okay.
In December, we predicted that the industry would make somewhere around 29.3 billion. Do we have a revised estimate as to what that might look like this year?
Well, no, we don't. Those estimates are for an ongoing
is now
industry.
Exiting.
At the moment, I think we're concerned that large parts of the industry might not be there because they're immediately running out of cash. I guess what I would point to is the global financial crisis, where the industry in 2008 and 2009 lost about $30 billion, which was about 5%. We're looking, I would have thought, certainly something of that scale.
Okay. We have a question saying we've spoken about the importance of air cargo in delivering medical equipment and sort of helping in this crisis, but what other supply chains do we think will be particularly affected if air cargo is disrupted?
Well, air cargo already has been disrupted, and China, is the centre of manufacturing for the world. With something 30 to 40% of the world's manufacturing taking place in China, and a lot of assembly. It's air cargo is important for pharmaceuticals. Obviously, we've discussed that, but it's also very important for the electronics industry and the autos industry. Many of those companies, computer manufacturers, iPhones, etc., depend on China for the supply chains. And so we're seeing a lot of disruption in key industries around the world.
Perhaps to add also to that, as you know, the cargo is important for the fresh, for the transportation of fresh vegetables, fruits, goods, all over the world. So another possible disruption if it's not properly handled.
Okay, thank you. Another question asking just for clarification on percentage drop that we see in passenger numbers. Brian, did you want to handle that?
Yes. So we have not produced revised forecasts. We presented two scenarios. The worst case scenario, where the industry was expected to lose $113 billion. In terms of passenger numbers, that was something like a 16% drop on average for the world. But I think we are beyond that point, and we'll be taking a look at revising those numbers soon. Our concern today, as I say, though, is really on the cash position and the fact that it's running out rather quickly.
Okay. We have a question asking about labor and what role do we see labor playing in this crisis?
We see, first of all, they are playing a key role in doing their day-to-day job when they are still assigned to their job, and implementing all the measures to fight against the coronavirus. So cleaning, disinfecting, maintenance for the aircraft
Is now exiting.
or taking care of the potential infected passengers. So they do their job, and they comply with the guidelines and the recommendations for fighting against the virus. So that's the first type. And secondly, we ask a lot of airlines have asked their staff to not only to work from home, but to accept pay reduction or unpaid leaves, or even restructuring and staff reduction. So that's the way. Unfortunately, we have to fight against the economic consequences. Is together with our staff and with the understanding that we have to take tough measures to reduce our costs and to limit our cash shortage. Otherwise, companies could disappear.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. Next question is about the imposition of travel bans, and the question is: do we think governments have done a good job in coordinating and communicating those bans or restrictions?
I have to say that, unfortunately, all the travel restriction bans on travel or border closures are sovereign decisions made by governments.
Is now exiting.
Frankly, without a lot of coordination and I would say with no coordination. So it has been very, very difficult for airlines to cope with that, to be able to address all these issues. We are trying to help in IATA to understand what is happening, but it's a very fast-moving situation, and the reality is that in this uncoordinated way of restricting travel, we are struggling, and it's a very, very difficult situation to cope with for our members.
Okay. Next question is: how do we see this impacting ticket prices? I suppose that's in the longer term perspective.
Let me deal with that first of all. I mean, we're already seeing a big fall in ticket prices, and in the global financial crisis.
Is now exiting.
Airlines were able to encourage travellers back onto aircraft despite weaker confidence. But we're in a very different situation here because the fact is that there isn't a market. Borders have been closed. That mechanism does not work today.
Okay. We have a question on taxation, essentially saying that...
Christiane Ulrich, German press agency.
Is now exiting.
Hendrik Holloway a few weeks ago said that the industry needs to prepare and expect more taxation. Do you think after the crisis that will continue to be the attitude or intention of governments?
First of all, in the crisis time, we have asked, as we have understood in my preliminary remarks, for a very strong relief in taxation and reduction in taxation everywhere, wherever it can be done. So either it's specific to aviation or it's general on salaries, labor costs, income taxes, everything. So, and secondly, after the crisis, we hope that governments will understand that the fragility of this industry is due to low margins, heavy cost of capital, and that it is not economically and financially wise to increase taxation on a sector that is structurally fragile and financially weak.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions about aircraft and manufacturers. So first is, do we think
now joining
will be the end of the 380 and the 747? And do we anticipate that airlines will be postponing or canceling orders?
It's an airline decision, of course, depending on its own financial situation and on the contract they have with the aircraft manufacturers, to maintain or to postpone orders. We have already
now exiting.
Many airlines are delaying their orders, canceling some orders. So it happens. It will most probably happen to see delays or cancellation. It's not a surprise. For the wide body and the two big ones, 747 and A380, for these two aircraft, we know that they were planned to be out of service due to fuel consumption and many other reasons. After when we come back to a normal situation, the use of these big aircraft is heavily depending on the way each airline wants to run a route commercially, on the traffic flows that there are. So it's not a decision that you make only based on a crisis period for the longer term.
Leo Branco
is now exiting.
Okay, just a couple more questions. One is, how big is the financial debt of the industry over the next 2 months?
Okay, sorry, can you repeat that? How big is?
Yeah, how big is the debt, the industry's debt, basically?
Oh, right. Okay. I think on average, it's about, just under 4 times earnings, and a credit rating agency would really consider an investment grade company someone with no more than 2 times debt, 2 times earnings. So that's the industry average. I'd stress though that we've got there's a group of airlines with very strong balance sheets, but they're a relatively small number. And if you recall the earlier charts, it showed that those outside of that top group have probably got debt of about 5 times earnings.
Okay. And then I think this will be the last question. We've spoken about the difficult situation in Europe as if it was a homogeneous market. But are there more or less impacted parts of Europe as a result of this crisis?
In Europe, the southern Europe, Italy, Spain, and now France and Greece are heavily impacted, even by the virus. The crisis is tougher. The northern part is slightly less impacted, but is it a matter of delay? It's very difficult to know. We are not specialists on that. But in terms of traffic, it is clear that southern Europe is more heavily impacted than northern Europe. It's still a very, very negative impact, even on the northern part of Europe.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Alexandre and Brian. We've